Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving headfirst into an incredibly deep, meticulously crafted sci-fi fantasy universe. If you've ever looked at a massive story and wondered exactly how creators build worlds that feel, endlessly rich and mathematically perfect, well, you are definitely in for a treat. We are going to completely decode the universe of Legends of Wind Rebellion.
In the silence of the logic gate, where variables unwind, I trace the 13 pathways of the architect's design. Now that's not just some beautiful poetry spoken by our protagonist, Matthias Mindblade. In this specific universe, words and logic are literal, physical mechanisms that can alter reality itself.
So, how are we going to unpack all this? We've got a 6-step agenda today. First, the geometry of orb space. Then, architecture of resonance, the Black Book erasure, rebellion in the drift, the 16th order logic, and we'll wrap it all up with the architect's blueprint.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the geometry of orb space. Okay, so you need to understand that orb space isn't just a map. Navigating it is basically a mathematical rule. Think of it like a giant layered server stack. On one side, we've got calibrated realities. These are the physical worlds where people actually live. But on the other side, hidden behind this dividing membrane called the Void Silk Veil, is the raw, uncalibrated truth of the architect ghost city. And get this, it's a dimension of living geometry that literally hungers for memory and biological input.
Now, to keep a world this incredibly complex from just totally falling apart, the creator divides the lore into 4 rigid phases. Phase 1 lays down the foundational math. Phase 2 builds out the gritty industrial environments. Phase 3 handles how the characters actually interact with these rules. And finally, Phase 4 synthesizes the whole shebang into massive world events. It's an absolutely brilliant blueprint for anyone trying to build a universe that scales up without losing its core identity.
Moving right along to Section 2, Architecture of Resonance.
You've got to love the intense thematic duality we have going on here. On the one hand, we have the Citadel of Mindblade. It's basically a porcelain tomb where the elite curate stolen vitality, specifically the siphoned heartbeat of an ancient entity called the Peace Stone. It's sterile, it's clinical, and it's incredibly fragile. But then, on the other hand, you have the Drift Sanctuary. Picture a graveyard of rusted iron dreadnoughts and scavenged tech that just smells of ozone and recycled sweat. These two environments represent entirely different vibrational frequencies that are just constantly clashing with one another.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Black Book erasure.
So here's a question for you. How do you fight an enemy that simply deletes you? That question right there lies at the very heart of the conflict. In most sci-fi, you fight an evil empire with lasers or swords. But what happens when the enemy doesn't even use weapons? What happens when they act as a neutral arbiter, enforcing a multiversal equilibrium? Enter the terrifying Black Book Empire. The Black Book Empire operates on something they call clinical silence. They deploy these rotating, light-drinking polyhedrons called erasers. And if one of those touches you, you don't just die, you simply cease to have ever existed. Your entire historical resonance is wiped completely clean from the dimension's ledger. So our heroes aren't just fighting for, say, political freedom. They're actively fighting against systemic, multiversal deletion protocols.
All right, on to Section 4, Rebellion in the Drift.
Now that we know the stakes, let's track our main crew, Matthias Mindblade, the Poem Mage Fireball Sally, and the Scavenger Highwayman, to see these survival mechanics play out in real time. Day 1, we see them flee to collapsing data rod of the Citadel. Day 2, they're crossing that terrifying Void Silk Veil where space literally weeps light. By Day 5, they find refuge in the abrasive heat of the Drift Sanctuary, and then by Day 10, they're raiding a logistics hub to steal a hyperconduit, which ultimately leads them to the ancient Starforge on Day 12. It is just a relentless, gritty demonstration of survival.
Let's pivot to Section 5, the 16th Order Logic.
This is where things get really wild. Narrative choices actually become literal functional computer logic here. To bypass deadly security fields or survive the Ghost City, Matthias has to use cognitive attunement. He has to embrace the friction and hold contradictory truths in his mind at the exact same time, a super intense condition known as the broken vessel state. By doing this, he weaves the 16th order logic, effectively tricking the universe's code into accepting him and his friends not as anomalies to be deleted, but as authorized noise. They are literally chanting poetry that acts as computer code to rewrite reality.
And this logic, it scales way up to govern entire civilizations. We've got the Leporian Empire relying entirely on curated starlight resonance.
Coracados runs purely on rigid industrial efficiency. Black Book, as we know, enforces clinical silence, and the Drift Nomads survive through messy, survivalist friction. The whole narrative is basically building toward this massive climax called the Convergence of Empires, where these four totally incompatible programming languages are forced into a violent, singular collision.
And that leads us perfectly into our final part, Section 6, the Architect's Blueprint.
So, the number 16, it's not just an arbitrary number in this framework. It represents the ultimate threshold. It is literally the point of total sight where cold logic transforms into living alchemy. It's the exact frequency needed to unlock the original harmonic template of the universe, which has been hidden away for millennia.
At the massive climax inside the Starforge, Matthias actually fuses a Rosetta key directly into his own nervous system so he can interface with the central node. He discovers the original architect's blueprint alongside a fragment of the uncorrupted P-Stone. And by claiming this, he achieves what the framework calls 20th order mastery. His observations literally become assets, and his insights become the physical infrastructure for a brand new world. He manages to override the Black Book's censors, but instead of keeping this godlike power for himself, he returns to the outcasts in the Drift to give them what he calls hope with teeth.
Ultimately, this world-building framework treats lore not just as some static background dressing, but as a dynamic, interactive, operating system. I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on as you explore your own narrative architectures. In a universe where logic gates decide reality, will you accept the perfect symmetry of non-existence, or will you be the friction that absolutely refuses to die? Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and keep building.